What I witnessed in the States was a really serious presence of African Americans, Hispanics. It wasn't an ethno-nationalist white revenge movement. It was remarkably, in that way, diverse as a coalition. And outside is this huge crowd. It's very Roman. Caesar is being crowned. Trump views himself as a king. When I say Caesar and Napoleon, I'm not mucking about. We now must view America as a monarchy.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. It's been quite a week. I've noticed people who were formerly supportive and quite enthusiastic about the Trump-Vance project suddenly sounding much cooler. I think there's a difference between how that extraordinary exchange in the Oval Office was perceived in Europe versus in America. A lot of people over here, even if they're of a conservative mind, perhaps particularly if they're conservatively minded, and even if they're so-called realists, people who believe that a peace deal must be made between Russia and Ukraine and that mistakes have been made on the Western side and so on, even among that group, the exchange seems to have really shocked people and made people think again about how uncritical they should be of this new Trump-Vance-Musk government. It's a confusing time. It's hard to know, frankly, who the good guys are. So, how should good people respond? Well, if you're not afflicted with Trump derangement syndrome, in either direction, by the way, neither madly critical nor slavishly devoted, then this is the channel for you. We commit to not being activists. Our mission is to look for little pockets of truth or wisdom wherever we can find them, to hope for the best but call out the worst, and to kick the tires on whatever the prevailing narrative is, even if it is our friends who are excited about it. Who better to unpick these contradictions with us today than the man who embodies them within one person? Labour's rebel lord, Maurice Glasman. He is beloved of Steve Bannon and J.D. Vance. He was the only sitting British parliamentarian inside the Capitol Rotunda for Donald Trump's inauguration, but he's also written beautifully about his heritage inside Ukraine. He feels a close connection to that country. He's visited many times since war broke out. He's the founder of Blue Labour, which is an intellectual source for many inside the Trump movement, and importantly, he's a good friend. Welcome to UnHerd, Lord Glasman.
Thank you, Freddie. Great to see you.
Let's start in the Rotunda, because we haven't caught up officially since then. So how did it come to pass that you were the only British politician who was invited by the administration to celebrate their inauguration, and how was that experience for you?
Well, the experience was really, as they used to say in Hackney in the 70s, far out, man. It was a big experience. I'm going to write about it for UnHerd. I haven't written about it. It's been very hectic since I've been back, and so I'm still mulling it over.
They love you, basically. I mean, I heard an independent source told me that Steve Bannon was going around pointing at your chest saying, "This man is a hero, this man is a hero." The MAGA crowd really are into Lord Glasman.
Well, what I would say is that the only instruction I was given as the only Labour person there was to build relationships with the Trump people. So I tried to do that. But there's a long story going back. Blue Labour is sovereigntist. We were very strong for Brexit, to leave the EU. I want to see my country actually embrace the possibilities of that, industrial strategy, build up our army, be the leader in Europe, those things. And the story itself is a literary story, really. A number of years ago, I got a book from someone I'd never heard of, had no idea who he was, which was J.D. Vance, who sent Hillbilly Elegy with a note saying, I like your word. I mean,
so he's a fan of yours?
Well, I don't know so far, but my mum always said, if someone gives you a present and there's no note, there's no need to write a thank you letter. But if someone gives a personal note, you should say thank you. Mm-hmm. So I followed her advice and I wrote back and I said, thank you for your book. And I thought it was a good book. I thought it was about dispossession, Appalachian Mountains, working class culture in America, how that...
The kind of Blue Labour themes.
Yeah, but in a very American context, particularly that West Virginia dereliction, drug addiction, alcoholism, the closing of the mines, the no jobs. So I wrote back and said, that very nice book, really appreciate it, thank you. And he wrote back, and unbelievably, in retrospect, he was asking, Do you think it's possible to rebuild the New Deal coalition in the Democrats? You know, that he didn't seem to be aligned with the Republicans at all. And I didn't really think about it.
Yeah, he's been on a bit of a journey, as they say.
A journey, as Tony Blair would say, the journey. And I didn't think anything of it. And I just said, well, I'm having a hard enough time in a party called Labour, to get the Labour interest represented. So good luck with that. And it was just 2-3 emails went down the memory hole. I couldn't help but notice that he had made some decisions along the way. But I make a personal rule not to write to people if they win, because it makes you look a bit like So we didn't have any communication for 8 years, I think, 7-8 years.
But then he just invited you out of the blue?
It was the Republican National Committee that invited me in the name of transatlantic dialogue. And Vance put a note in there saying, really looking forward to meeting you when you come.
Which you did?
Which I did.
How was that?
He didn't show his dark side to me. He was very affable, very friendly. I mean, obviously he had some, points to make about my government, to increase defence spending, but he certainly gave me the impression that he was very interested in the UK as an ally in this work that they're doing.
So you were quite pumped about the Trump victory, it's fair to say. We've got, these are
You've
quotes.
got quotes.
I've got quotes from you. Trump is a world historical figure now, and what he represents is the end of globalization. Labour should be dancing in the streets about this, really. You call the MAGA coalition a multi-ethnic, interfaith, working-class coalition against progressives. So explain that for us, because that, I think, to people watching will be the confusion. You're a Labour guy, you're of the left. How can you be buddies with Steve Bannon and excited about MAGA? Just explain it.
There's 2 points there. As you can see from the invitation for Vance, it was literary. And Bannon and Vance have been developing an anti-globalisation position and a national sovereignty position. Also, particularly those two, but there's others. There's Owen Cass, an American Compass. There's Patrick Deneen. There's a very interesting conversation about Labour, about the dignity of Labour, that globalisation was the glorification of finance capital over industrial capital, that the working class have had a really bad deal. So, as a leftist, as a socialist, I have spent my useless life railing against globalisation, railing against New Labour. You remember Tony Blair? Globalisation is like the changing of the seasons. There's nothing you can do about it. As spring follows winter, so it will be. Borders won't matter. Technology overwhelms borders. Either adapt or die. And any opposition to that, if you remember, Freddie, from our early days of our friendship, Blue Labour, nostalgic. Industry is gone. But it's not gone. It's in China. It's a real thing. So
do you feel you kind of won the argument on that in a way, and that the revenge of nation states and of industrial policy and those things are kind of a Blue Labour success?
Yeah. Okay, so I say reality has won the argument, and we just happen to notice the reality of those trends. So as someone who really has spent 4 decades arguing against the inevitability of globalisation, this is a very decisive moment. The world has changed. The very hegemon of globalisation, since really, you could look at it 2 ways. You could look at it post-war way, or you could look at it Thatcher-Reagan. I don't know if you want to get involved, but let's just say that Thatcher-Reagan, 79, was the most important thing was the free movement of capital and labour. And so a world of immigration, a world of deindustrialization for higher wage economies, the centrality of China in terms of having a 24-hour day, no free and democratic trade unions, uninterrupted production, the investment of UK and US capital into China in order to facilitate that growth. That's really over. I mean, that's the whole thing is over.
Which you are pleased about.
That's why I say we should be dancing in the street. This is... So the left didn't do it. That's a huge lesson for us. How can there be a socialist, insurgent, pro-worker, pro-nation state, sovereignty position to change the economic structures? This space opens up now within this. there's a breaking of the multilateral treaty world where you can't do any politics. You can't do it because it's illegal, Freddie. It's illegal to do anything. And it's also broken this idea that any anti-capitalist, pro-democracy, pro-nation state movement is populist. But, this is bad, very bad. Populism, very bad. So, the rule of lawyers, I want to see that broken. I want to see the re-emergence of real democratic politicians who act. So that's the thing about the dancing in the street.
So that's the invigoration.
Yeah, so we've got to look at this space as a really great space for Labour, for social democracy, for socialism, because that was always predicated on state sovereignty, nationalisation, and those things. The second one is to break the news to the people I call progressives, and it's the last thing you want to hear when you go to the doctor, Freddie. It's progressive. Okay, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing at all. It's like a disease, a weakness, a palsy, as we can see with the EU, as we can see all around. Is that what I witnessed in the States was a really serious presence of African Americans, Hispanics on MAGA Square, in the big. It wasn't an ethno-nationalist white revenge movement. It was remarkably, in that way, diverse as a coalition. And what I was talking about there, in the Rotunda, for example, it was on Martin Luther King Day, of all symbolic days. And they had a black preacher from Detroit. And outside is this huge crowd. There's a massive, what I call MAGA Square. There's a huge crowd. It's very Roman, Caesar is being crowned, and the popoli are on the street, and then the senatori and the Peznovante are in the rotunda witnessing the event. And the black preacher said, "Free at last." He said, "Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last." And you could hear the crowd. That was the one moment when you heard the roar of the crowd. So first of all, you're not going to get a white ethno-nationalist crowd cheering on a black preacher on Martin Luther King Day saying we're free at last. And I asked them later, what were you cheering? In what way are you free at last now? And it was, we're free from the thought police, we're free from the lanyard, we're free from this idea that you can't... There was a genuine sense of liberation from HR, just the relentless policing of your speech and actions. So that's what I was talking about in the quotes that you gave me.
It's really interesting, and I've heard that from some other sort of sources, really, that there's like a almost existential exuberance around this shift.
Yeah,
so as much as I said at the top there, lots of Europeans will be very anxious about it, and I'm sure we'll come on to those things, the areas it could go horribly wrong. But the positive bit, the bit that you were excited by, is that it's somehow a smashing down of an order that was stultifying and oppressive to working people.
That's the thing. And also, it's not just at the level of progressive ruling class oppression, which they obviously felt. It also opens up the possibilities of industrialisation, growth of trade unions, a national state economic policy. I remember early Blue Labour when we were speaking and we say we need a national economic. No, there's no such thing as a national economy. We are integrated within the EU, and the EU is integrated into the global system. And I can't tell you the level in which we were told to shut up, just that was nostalgic. But now we have to really seriously think about those things. So we're in a new era.
So can I suggest then that there are different strands within the MAGA movement?
That's clear.
So let's just clear them up. So it sounds like the corner of MAGA Square that you are excited by is a kind of J.D. Vance, or in its more extreme incarnation, Steve Bannon, which is almost a left populist movement, which is about centering workers, and it's against finance, and it's about reindustrialization and so on. There is also the Elon Musk side of the square. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I think that's the right way. I don't call it a corner. I would call it, MAGA Square has two sides. So at the top of MAGA Square lives the king, and the king and his court. That's understood completely. So one thing we really should talk about is how significant this change is. I compare it to Caesar turning Rome from a republic into an imperium. I also compare it to Napoleon on the 18th of Brumaire crowning himself. What did he crown himself? He crowned himself the Emperor of the Republic. Okay, and you had to call him Your Majesty. These were very significant shifts from essentially institutional republican rule to monarchy. Trump has all the attributes of a king. It's worth talking about.
Yeah, well, let's come back to that.
Have you seen the size of the executive orders?
Yeah.
I mean,
but let's come back to that. But on the kind of Musk
so the
side,
king lives.
Yeah, so you've got the king on one side,
and then you've got the square, the demos.
Okay.
So let's talk Roman. This is the demos. He is a tribune of the demos. And he talks to the demos all the time. He's not talking to anybody else. I saw him sign at a rally executive orders in front of a crowd of 20,000, holding them up. It was an extraordinary...
We did it last night in the Capitol at his speech. I mean, that is his style, absolutely.
But it's imperial, senatorial, Caesarist, or in a more modern term, Bonapartist. That's how it is. And my sense of MAGA Square is that they are devoted to the king, that they support the king, as we do, of course.
Our king.
Our king, yeah. And I think he's going to have a bigger role to play. We can talk about that. So then the square. The square itself has a left and a right, certainly. And the overwhelming preponderance that I saw was sympathy with the Vance Bannon left, which actually wants ordinary life. They want secure, stable, peaceful, urban life. That's their big thing.
So that's the bit that is more sympathetic to Blue Labour.
Yeah, they understand.
Who else falls onto that side? So J.D. Vance, Steve Bannon, Oren Cass, presumably.
Definitely Oren Cass is a very interesting conversational partner. He's much more cerebral and thoughtful, but also all of those people, of which I'm one, really hold the dignity of Labour high. That what's been a desecration of the person with horrible jobs, terrible human resources, oppression,
That side of the square is also the more Christian side, and they tend to be sort of socially conservative and quite keen on traditional family structures and all of that.
Yeah.
Are you on board with that component?
Virtually all of them have been divorced, so it's not a naive position of, but the family matters, that family is a fundamental obligation. It's a very deep one, that parents have responsibilities to their children and also responsibilities to the older generation. We could go into that, but it's not what it was. Historically, the Republicans have been the Protestant party, the WASP party, a very individual sense of responsibility and redemption, but certainly Vance and Bannon are much more Catholic.
And Cass.
And Cass, yeah, completely.
They're all three Catholics.
So my inspiration, one of my primary inspirations, has always been Catholic social thought. The dignity of labour, solidarity and everything, and subsidiarity, local. The power should be at the most local. Now, obviously, Catholic social thought also has this fissure between the left and the right, but the MAGA Square, what they pray. I mean, when they're having arguments on the square, it's quite funny to see, and it's getting heated. Somebody will say, I think we should pray and heal the wounds before we carry on.
But so I think we've got a sense of the left-hand side of the square. What are your thoughts about the other strand?
Well, they're the enemies. I mean, obviously, in my view, I'm very firmly aligned to the left. That conversation on the left of MAGA Square. On the right, you've got Musk. To a certain extent, you've got Teal. So what their concern is the application of technology in an unfettered way. So Musk talks about living till you're 400, so almost eternal life, very transhumanist, very secular.
Not interested in workers' rights, that's for sure. It's more about how many can be sacked than how many jobs can be rescued.
So that is the future of the politics of Trump. It's a genuine conflict between the left and the right of MAGA Square over the direction of the country, over the application of technology, over borders. Musk arguing you have to have the skilled workers. And on the square, when I was there, they were very anti-Musk on getting those visas. Really interesting, when I was there was the head of the Teamsters went to see Trump and said, if you apply the new technology and automation to the ports, our communities will die. Trump came out and said, no new technology in the ports. We go with the with the people who work there, the great longshoremen, we would call them dockers. So the tussle is very strong between these competing visions.
I suppose in Trump's head, I mean, who knows what happens in Trump's head, but at least
I don't think it's that complicated.
The way that it can cohere is that in order to revitalize the economy and in order for the nation to be strong, it needs to be competitive. It needs to win against international competitors, and therefore you can't have bloat in the public sector. You've got to embrace the possibilities of technology for that strength.
It's so rare that I would even dissent a little from your analysis, but may I?
Please.
It's a bit different, I think. So, when Trotsky and Stalin were competing for Lenin's crown, so to speak, Trotsky went for internationalism, permanent revolution. Stalin went for socialism in one country. That was his position. I think the best way to understand Trumpism at the moment is capitalism in one country. They're going to put the tariffs up. They don't give a damn about international competition. I mean, when I said, why aren't you, why are you doing this? Why don't you invest on the international market? No. America is big enough to be self-sufficient. America has the resources, has the technology, has the manpower to be a almost entirely self-sufficient country. So there is going to, it's more like the competition within the country is they consider the last 40 to 50 years as an endless subsidy to the Chinese Communist Party to build up their power, and that's got to break. So they're putting enormous pressure on American capital to invest in America. That's... do you see what I mean? So it's not that they're worried about international competition. They're only concerned that the state has become this bloated, progressive behemoth. This is the Doge thing, just US aid. All of this is ideological, they think. Soros, they say, you talk to us about oligarchs. What about Soros? What about the NGO industrial complex? What about the...
And what about them? Are they not right on those points?
Yeah, well, that's all fine. Smash it up, But that's what I'm saying.
So which is the bit that you're worried about from the right of the square? Then,
no. So I mean,
if the Musk brigade are
pleased, in this sense, for them, Musk is in the right position because he's dealing with government waste.
Yes,
of which there is a huge amount. My concern, obviously, and my opposition, I'm not worried about it, I think it's a living political battle, is about the power of oligarchs and capitalists to set the agenda, which will be against the interests of the working class. So, very much alive on the left of MAGA Square is how do we rebuild unions, for example, that can represent workers' interests in negotiations. It is the only Secretary of State, or whatever they're called, who hasn't been appointed yet is the Labour one. Because there are what you would call musky Republicans, old, what they call Bush Republicans, who are just simply pro-capitalist, anti-worker, and they don't want any working class power. But if you look at that left side, the Vance, Bannon, Dineen, Cass area, they are very organised in defence of workers' interests. So that's the battle ahead in MAGA Square.
Let's bring Ukraine into the conversation
Let's do that.
Early, otherwise I worry we might run out of time before we get to it. I mean, that was the big... I talked at the top there about how there's been a bit of a mood shift over here, and it's certainly true among people who I describe as having a conservative mindset, because to a lot of those people, the way Zelensky was treated and the way he was spoken to by these two big figures of Trump and Vance either side of him somehow transgressed some kind of deeply held moral. That's not how you should treat a wartime leader who, flawed as he may be, is trying to defend his country. You must have watched clips of that exchange. What did you think of it?
Well, for me, it was all part of the script. I mean, it's not as if Trump and Vance have not signalled their opposition to the war. So the first thing to understand is how do they view the Ukraine war? They view the Ukraine war as a catastrophe of American foreign policy. They think it's directly the result. There's a real demon figure over there, Victoria Nuland, who was moving around, whipping up unrealistic expectations, basically lying to the Ukrainians, saying, NATO, you're going to get into NATO, you're going to go into the EU. that you can move seamlessly from the Soviet Union to the European Union into NATO. And they're saying, whoever said this? Whoever thought that this was the case? They think that Russia has been treated extremely disrespectfully, to use their language, since '89. You know, that there was this agreement not to expand NATO, NATO expanded, and now you're going to put nuclear weapons on the Russian border and you think that's okay? So I'm just giving you...
That's what they think. What do you think?
Oh, if you want to get... Okay.
I mean, how did you respond as someone who is sympathetic to them but is a Labour person with Ukrainian interests?
We've got to clarify my position now as you're pushing me on this. I support my country. This was the position I was in at that particular moment, and I saw great possibilities for Britain, which I think are being realised. So we are a European power, and we do not want the expansion of any form of Russian dominion in Europe. They're hostile, and we absolutely have committed ourselves to supporting sovereignty in Ukraine, national sovereignty in Ukraine. For me, I oppose Ukraine joining NATO and the EU. I think the EU would be a catastrophe and destroy their industrial base. We could talk about that. I think the EU is a death trap, you know, and you can see it falling apart. We can talk about that. You know, I've got long-standing. But for the UK, what we can do is be loyal to Bevin. My hero is Ernest Bevin, who said very clearly after the war that our relationship with America was based on absolute alliance and real autonomy, that we can act outside their control. That was fantastic cabinet minutes, Freddie. 1946, the Labour Chancellor says, guys, we're bankrupt. You know, we're creating the NHS, we've just come out of the war, we're nationalising this, we're nationalising that. We have to reduce the size of our army. And Ernest Bevin just said, no, we don't. And that was the end of the cabinet conversation. They meant that the UK was fundamental in establishing NATO, which bound America into a common defence policy, and the United Nations, where the Security Council. So Britain could act autonomously and in deep relationship with the United States. That's the goal that I'm pursuing. So I am very, very impressed with the way that Keir Starmer dealt with the situation in Washington. He went and he said, we want to go further, faster with you. We are bound to you. But we are going to put troops on the ground in Ukraine and we're going to defend Ukraine.
So you support Britain either talking about or actually literally putting troops on the ground in Ukraine?
I think the commitment has been made. And I think that's going to be within an American brokered ceasefire. So I think we're talking about mid-April to late April, not very far away, 6 to 8 weeks. There will be a cessation of hostilities, a ceasefire that will be brokered by the United States and Russia. And
I'm surprised that I felt, and I might have got this wrong, that quite a deep strand within Blue Labour was not engaging our armed forces in unwinnable distant conflicts, and whether J.D. Vance was referring to the UK or not, where he seemed to be quite withering about our 20 or 30,000 soldiers that we could offer, he's basically right that if the Russians are sincere and want to push further into Ukraine, the British Army is not going to be able to stop them. Is that right?
No, I don't think that's right. Well, I mean, I don't think that's right on several levels. I mean, first of all, for Blue Labour, we are disgusted with the degradation of our armed forces. A very big thing for us is to restore the honour and integrity of our armed forces. 75,000 is an inadequate number and that has to be doubled. But secondly, this is the route to an industrial strategy where Britain becomes the leading military power in Europe. Obviously, we hope that the ceasefire will hold, but the crucial thing is with the UK and Ukraine, in alliance with Ukraine and the strengthening outside NATO, outside the EU, for deeper bilateral relationship. And remember the three things that Ukraine has that are absolutely in our interests. The first is, as has been noted, the precious metals. They have really excellent deposits of graphite and titanium, as well as uranium and lithium, which I'm not so interested in, but the graphite and the titanium are essential for contemporary industrial production at every level, prosthetics, as well as military. And the second thing that they have is an extraordinary thing for me to witness, which they still have an industrial working class. They have very skilled workers. The engineers are astonishing. Their drone production in this war, how do you think they've kept this monster at bay for 3 years? They're constantly inventing new forms of drones, both in the air and on sea. I'm full of awe for that, and the factories are really working and the workforce is completely engaged in that process. And the third thing is, obviously, they've got a really effective army. Now, those three aspects are absolutely aligned with the UK interests. So what I think is UK takes the lead in Europe in defending Europe from further Russian aggression. I do think, even unbelievably, Freddie, your homeland of Sweden, so non-aligned,
not anymore,
so social democratic, is actually a very great partner for us now, because they understand what this means, that there is a genuine, not only a genuine threat from Russia, but a genuine way of restoring the solidarity.
So essentially you think then that the UK can be more engaged in Ukraine and take up some of the slack as the US recedes and gets less interested.
Yeah, so then comes the other side. So I think at the moment we're in, last Wednesday, I would say that most people would think that we had the crappiest government we'd ever seen, that it had no direction, that it was useless, that they didn't seem to discern any strategy or any notion of national renewal. I would say that coming back from the White House, Keir Starmer is a much enhanced figure. I think that the direction of the government is actually much clearer, which is to increase our army, which is to have an industrial strategy on the back of that, which is to take an active leadership role in Europe. Who would have thought that Keir Starmer would fill the space of Brexit? But this is what he's done. I wonder how Boris Johnson is feeling. He must be quite unhappy.
Let me just take you back to that Oval Office encounter last week, though, because that's what we talked about at the start. The level of animosity towards Zelensky and Ukraine felt by evidently J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, but also many people on the kind of MAGA online right, is much more intense than even the skepticism you might find here in Europe. What's the source of it, do you think? Why do they hate Ukraine so much?
I don't think they hate Ukraine as such. I don't think they know Ukraine. If they knew Ukraine, they'd know it was a really fundamentally Christian country, a very conservative country. That's what they see with Zelensky. Is they see Zelensky himself as a puppet of Biden. This goes back to the Hunter Biden escapade, if you remember, with the laptop and all of that. And then that goes deeper back into Newland, Obama, that Zelensky is a front man for the progressives. That
because he's aligned with their political opponents. He's aligned with the Biden family. He's considered a sort of darling of the
Clinton, Obama,
progressive elite.
Yes.
So it's almost like a cultural antipathy.
And he is a symbol of globalization. That he's this and
globe-trotting, raising money at the World Economic Forum, that kind of mood.
Lovey, an actor, but it goes deeper. That he is the product of the Democrats. That's how they see it. He's an absolute frontman for them, and Soros involvement and all the media subsidies, all of that. So they see him in that way, and they think that it's interesting. They don't think really that Ukraine has stolen them. They think that most of the money never got there because it was taken by American NGOs. that all of this is a symptom of the progressive malaise. So that's the second point. How do they view things in a geostrategic sense? That's even more important. So they think that Russia has been needlessly estranged and pushed closer to China. The fundamental enemy is China. Underneath China as a fundamental enemy lies Iran. They see these states as actively hostile to the United States' interest. And they don't think that Russia is, by its nature, actively hostile. They think that, so there's going to be a gangster summit with Trump and Putin. And so they think that there's a lot of bad faith has gone into the support for Ukraine, which cannot be backed up, and that it's a forever war, and it needs...
It sounds like we actually had a piece in UnHerd by Edward Lookback about this. He called it the reverse Nixon maneuver. They're actually trying to bring Russia away from China.
Exactly. This is, he's right on that. So there is a strategic vision behind this. And they've also got a third thing, which is that Europe has been deeply progressive in the sense that it talks a lot but doesn't do much. You know, that we support Ukraine.
Hard to deny that.
We support the territorial integrity. Well, if you support the territorial integrity of Ukraine, why aren't you sending soldiers to beat Russia? Because Russia is occupying a huge swathe of Ukraine. Oh, no, we don't want war, we want diplomacy. They think this is bullshit. And they're calling, Vance's speech in Munich is really worth reading. Okay, he's an internationalist, Vance. He's not an isolationist. And he wishes to see a revival of nation states and solidarity between nation states, and he thinks that there's been genuine threats to freedom of speech and freedom of religion going on in Western European countries that needs to be opposed. So the important thing now is how you think. And what I'm arguing for and saying is that we've left the EU, Britain is in a superb position to mediate between the United States and Ukraine and Europe. And this is exactly what's happening
So
now.
on the point that I was starting with, which is this sort of visceral distaste or discomfort about seeing someone like Zelensky being spoken to like that, is this just kind of old world niceties that we should have higher tolerance for transgressing, or are people right to be worried? Because it sounds from what you're saying that some of the version of reality that people like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are inhabiting is basically the Twitter world of reality with an exaggerated focus on things like Zelensky's previous acting performances and all of that stuff. Is it right to be worried that the leader, what we used to call the leader of the free world, is absolutely pickled in a kind of online version of reality that doesn't feel appropriately sober for someone in that position?
I get it. Okay, so first of all, Donald Trump is best understood as a gangster. There's interests. This guy's small potatoes. I know people are very, but for me, this was all part of a performative about change, that the rules have changed. And they were absolutely adamant that Zelensky was not going to come to Washington and get any more money. Okay, that was not going to, he's crazy if he thinks. So Zelensky is also the product of a Twitter world, virtue world that smashed. So what you had was the previous era and the present era having a symbolic collision. But I can assure you that within 2 weeks, Zelensky will be back in the Oval Office. There will be a conversation over precious metals. It will be extremely civil.
Do you think there will be a deal, and soon?
Yeah. And it will be all handshakes and smiles. This is much more about Trump signalling to Western Europe that he's not bluffing. And their words of love for Zelensky are all pious bullshit because they're not prepared to seal it in blood. Right? So, this is how I view it.
Just want to press you one final time on this British troops thing. You think there will be popular support for sending British troops to Ukraine, even if they start being killed?
Okay.
Do you think people will sign up for such a mission? Is there really the will in places like Britain and France to fight to defend Ukraine?
I don't care about France. Okay, I need to just say I really can't judge France, and my attitude to France is Second World War, they were completely conquered in 3 weeks. I don't trust their will.
It's a long time ago, but yeah.
No, okay. I'm saying, at first they say, there's an old song, first they say they do, and then they don't, and then you say you will, and then you won't. We know. Ever since the French Revolution, they've been a bit confused, let's put it that way. But let's park that. Let's park. What I see when I go out into the country, when I go to the council estates, Grimsby, Scunthorpe, little yellow and blue flags in the windows. There's a sense, I feel the sense in our country that They know who Putin is, and they know deep down in their guts that you can't let him get away with this. It's a very British thing. We had the same attitude to Hitler, we had the same attitude to the Kaiser. If you ask people, there's something bad going on and they can't get away with it. I don't think there would be any support for putting British troops in while the war is on. I think that the goal should be that the UK army goes into Ukraine as part of the ceasefire agreement in order to support Ukraine and resist Russian violations of the ceasefire. I think that will go on with American support, that will be brokered.
Including military support? American troops?
American military support for the UK army. Right, that's the key point.
So aircraft, potentially.
Well, also missiles, anti-missile technology, and we, as part of that, we will have to commit to increasing our industrial production of weapons. This is a vital aspect. So if America, which they are sees, this is the Starmer doctrine, if you like, if America witnesses that we're serious about fulfilling our responsibilities, that will come to them as a good news, not as a hostile news. Our relationship with the United States is close militarily, and we would wish to continue and intensify. But all of that will be mediated by the UK. It wouldn't be aid to Ukraine. It will be support for the UK, which will fulfill its responsibilities under the ceasefire terms to Ukraine. And I think that if the UK is the leading military power in Europe in brokering that ceasefire, then everybody can understand that leaving the EU was a necessary aspect of Britain being a leading power in Europe.
Let's end by thinking a little bit about...
It's gone fast, Freddie, it's gone fast.
It has, thank you. In British domestic politics, you're sounding kind of optimistic suddenly about the Starmer project. They've frozen you out previously. They seem to have chosen a much more progressive or liberal type of path, but now it feels like there's a guy called Morgan McSweeney who is central to the Number 10 operation, who is much more sympathetic with your way of seeing the world. Do you feel that the Labour government is going more blue Labour finally?
Well, this Labour government is finally becoming a Labour government. We had 6 or 7 months where it didn't really have a defined identity. It's amazing what crises can do, and what I'm not talking about blue Labour. I just say that the government is now clearly a patriotic government. It stands up for the British interest. I thought that the way Starmer spoke in the Oval Office, we want to go further and faster with you, he said, and we will put troops into Ukraine. He was saying, we have made that decision, and we would love it if you supported it. So he simultaneously asserted loyalty and autonomy. That's the trick. So obviously, setting aside blue Labour or anything, I'm Bevanite, and I can witness a Bevin move when I see one.
So do you foresee a kind of increase in popularity for the Starmer project? You think the lows are behind him?
I think that if we look at the polls that will come out next week, you will see a remarkable surge in Starmer's credibility and popularity. But that's what happens when you lead. Now they can see that he's a calm man who can deal with pressure, who can handle big. So he went and he really, gave Trump the invitation for a state visit. He played the king in beautifully. Trump obviously sees himself as a king. He really wants to
This is when he handed over the handwritten letter from the king.
Oh, by the way.
And he really rubbed that in. I mean, to some of us, it was a bit sort of too much. Oh, this is the biggest honour we've ever given anybody. The second invitation to a state visit's never happened before. You laid it on thick, it's fair to say. I think
if I was advising the government, I'd say don't take Freddie's queasiness too seriously. Yeah. Trump views himself as a king. What I've heard on the American side is he's beginning to sign executive orders as King Trump, right? That's now his signature. When I say Caesar and Napoleon, I'm not mucking about and saying, oh, this is just an academic analogy. He views himself as a monarch.
You've heard he's actually signed executive orders as King Trump?
I have been told that. I have not witnessed that, but I've been told that by several sources.
You heard it here first.
You heard it here first. we now must view America as a monarchy. And therefore, as a monarchy, it's not really very clever to keep on going on. Our head of state is the king. We're a monarchy too. Trump wants to meet the king. He really likes the king. What is the problem? You just bring them together. And I think what we're going to see is that it's quite a large role for the monarch in the negotiation with the United States. And from what I'm hearing also, that the king is prepared to go to visit Ukraine, which is a huge step. And I can assure you, having been to Ukraine 12 times since the war started, when I go to talk to Ukrainians, they always ask me about the monarchy. And when the Queen died, oh my God, it was a moment of mourning in Ukraine. I can't describe it. They were, the loss of so. And I had your queasiness, and then I forgot about it.
But you said at the start, you're a Democrat. You want real democracies where the will of the people is enacted by a functioning government. It sounds like you're sort of at peace with the idea that we're shifting into a monarchical future, or at least America's sounding monarchical.
This is
How
a
do we
paradox.
square that?
I am absolutely committed to the democratic monarchy. I love the fact that our head of state is the king. I think it's an object of affection and loyalty outside politics. And I think I don't like politicians as presidents and heads of state because it's parties. It gets ugly as your country, Sweden, is a monarchy, and there's great wisdom in our ancient constitution and our system, and it is absolutely our glory that we can send a monarch to visit someone who thinks he's a monarch. And that aids and deepens. Obviously, I think the American Revolution was a mistake. The French Revolution was a mistake. I think the future is very democratic monarchies.
Which doesn't describe the Trump situation in the United States.
No, but there is a very democratic component. So what I'm saying is they really won an election. I mean, this is real. Obviously,
they won with just under 50% of the vote.
It was supposed to be too close to call. They won the Senate, they won the Congress, they won the presidency, and particularly as far as I'm concerned, they really significant swing among working class voters was the decisive thing. There is a very strong, it's a paradoxical movement. It's simultaneously quite insurgent, incendiary, vote them out. You know, their democratic machine is very strong.
Coming back to the UK though.
Yeah.
I love to get people to make predictions because then we can haul them back when they don't turn out. What happens in 4 years' time, do we think, here? Because we haven't mentioned the word reform or Nigel Farage. I've seen you have a TV show with Nigel Farage.
He backed out, guys. He backed out.
But you've had some good conversations with him. You seem to get on very well.
Very well, very well.
And, but then you're also apparently now quite friendly with the Starmer government. If there's a competition between those, where do you think the energy goes?
Okay.
Do you see a reform increase, or do you think Labour could win the day?
So from the day of the election, July the 4th, was it? Until last week, it was as if we were playing into the hands of reform. I mean...
Labour?
The Labour government, yeah. Reform was surging. Last time I looked, Farage was on 28%, and he was 4 points. I mean, there's an insurgent working class rage against globalisation, against progressivism. That's very parallel to Trump, but with distinctive English characteristics. Nigel Farage was the tribune of that. I've long said to Farage, to everybody, my opposition to Nigel Farage is that he's a saloon bar Thatcherite. He's got no idea of the role of the state, of trade unions, of reindustrialisation, and is a Putin apologist. He's got no idea that the UK's destiny lies in defending a fellow democratic sovereign nation state against foreign. So he doesn't have an idea of the armed forces, of industrialisation. So the crucial way to combat reform is for Labour to be the patriotic party of the armed forces, of industry, of the monarchy. Here we go. And what I'm saying now is the dynamics are in play. You will see a revival of Labour in the coming weeks, but then my issue is, have you got the depth and the determination and the resolution to go along this path that you've opened up this week? And if we do, we will see a real Labour government win the next election.
It's quite telling that we haven't even mentioned the word Conservative, at least not
no
with a capital
interest
C.
whatsoever.
Haven't mentioned Kemi Badenoch.
I'm not interested.
You just think they're irrelevant?
Done. They're not saying anything, they're not doing anything, because they're not Conservatives. I mean, this is the thing. 2019, take back control, 1 million migrants a year, 1 million a year when they ran on a restrict migration. Their whole economic model is the Deliveroo, is that immigrants deliver food to a nation that's forgotten how to cook. It's like, this is bullshit of a high order. And I don't see the Conservatives really playing any role. So it's Labour versus Reform. That's the next election. And now, for the first time, I can see a Labour position which is really credible.
Maurice Glasman. Lord Glasman, thanks
Freddie.
for coming to UnHerd.
Always.
That was Lord Maurice Glasman, a Labour peer, someone who was actually appointed by Ed Miliband, amazingly enough, who now very much ploughs his own intellectual furrow and is influencing people across the political spectrum with his very original and fresh way of looking at things. I always find it stimulating and in this case quite optimistic making to talk to Maurice Glasman. I feel a little bit better about the world than I did an hour ago. I don't know if the same is true for you. Let us know in the comments. As ever, this was UnHerd.